Greetings. My name is Mrs. Ciara Noel, the coordinator for Civic Engagement and Intercultural Education in the Center for Student Engagement and Intercultural Programs. I want to welcome you to the 2022 Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Commemoration Celebration Program. Today, we celebrate the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We honor the fact that his dream was not one that was simply a noun acknowledging a person, place, or thing, but one that became a verb and required action. As Dr. King once said, although we may have come in on different ships, we are now in the boat. Therefore, what matters most is what we are doing for others. Although there have been great strides made in addressing social injustices and civil liberties for all, we must not only pursue equality, but we must pursue equity through solidarity. We must remember Dr. King's dream was not only for one group of people, but it benefited all Americans from diverse backgrounds and experiences, both then and now. It is my hope that today we reflect on what we must do as a community to ensure that we are inclusive in our efforts to create peace, freedom, and justice for all. We will begin today's program by hearing from Mr. Carl Hampton, JD. Mr. Hampton is GSU's first Chief Diversity Officer and serves as a key member of the President's Cabinet. He brings over 10 years of experience working in diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education and government. Please welcome GSU's Chief Diversity Officer, Carl Hampton.
Dr. King's current legacy can be summed up in the question he posed almost 50 years ago. Where do we go from here? This was a theme for the National Civil Rights Museum's 50th commemoration of Dr. King's past legacy and the title of Dr. King's last book before his assassination. So it is important to answer that question today as we celebrate his birthday, his dedication to the civil rights movement, and how his work applies to our commitment to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion for faculty, staff, and students at Governor State University. In Memphis, during the year of 1968, where Dr. King was tragically assassinated, the city was becoming the epicenter of the civil rights movement that was fighting for equality for all. The strike of the Memphis sanitation workers, who were tasked with keeping the city clean and healthy for all of its residents while receiving substandard wages of poverty, was a manifest injustice that Dr. King felt he had a moral obligation to rectify. Sadly, many of the same battles Dr. King lost his life for over the past 50 years are still being fought today in 2022. It is fitting that while I'm speaking at an institution of higher education, Dr. King, as an undergraduate student at Morehouse College, wrote an essay for his studies about the importance of education in our society. He said that the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Therefore, in his formative years, Dr. King truly understood the value of education 70 years ago that gave us the key problem-solving skills to succeed in the global economy of the past, present, and the future. Dr. King's vision of the American dream is the bedrock of diversity, equity, and inclusion for all in our Jaguar family. In Dr. King's America, he wanted to have a nation where all individuals, regardless of their identities, had the same opportunities to maximize the quality of their lives as others. Dr. King also wanted to have social justice for all, which is a current inspiration for Dr. Green's reestablishment of social justice initiatives at GSU as our sixth president. Dr. King's famous quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," in 1963 resonates now more than ever as we have recently witnessed several tragic events of injustice involving violent racism resulting in the murder of innocent individuals of historically marginalized groups. In closing, I believe Dr. King would want this national and state holiday celebrating his birthday to be a call to action for advocacy for the issues he gave up his life for 50 years ago. Our campus community that is made up of our faculty, staff, and students, and the Chicago Southland community must reaffirm our commitment to social justice inspired by Dr. King's actions. We as Jaguars must more than ever work diligently against discrimination, poverty, food insecurity, physical and emotional health disparities, unfair housing practices, police misconduct, mass incarceration, and other historic manifest injustices. Thank you. Be safe and well.
Thank you, Chief Diversity Officer Hampton. Now we are excited to hear a vocal performance from Todd Rashaan. With over 20 years of experience in the entertainment world, Todd is an accomplished actor, playwright, singer, songwriter, vocal coach, and exceptional worship leader with a natural knack for people. His industry insight and professionalism is a great value to Chicago's acting community. In addition to being a great resource for actors and performers, he spends his time as a single dad to his adorable son, Taylon. Please welcome Todd Rashaan.
Thank you all for having me be a part of the celebration of such a great man. Before I render my selection, I must share some exciting news with you. The Center for Student Engagement and Intercultural Programs are looking for students, faculty, staff, and alumni to participate in diversity dialogues. This program will feature monologues on various tenets of diversity created by you to provide more insight on who we are in our communities. I, Todd Rashaan, have partnered with CSEIP to help you develop and share your stories. For more information, please email cseip@govst.edu. One day, when the glory comes, it'll be ours. It'll be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure. We will be sure. Oh, one day, when the glory comes, it'll be ours. It'll be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure. We will be sure. But the war is not finished. The battle is not won. But we'll fight until the finish. And when it's all said and done, we'll cry glory. Oh, glory. We'll cry glory. Oh, glory. Oh, one day, when the glory comes, it'll be ours. It'll be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure. We will be sure. Oh, one day.
What a wonderfully moving performance. Thank you so much, Todd. Now I would like to introduce to you our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Michael Benitez. A highly sought out speaker at colleges and conferences nationwide, Dr. Michael Benitez is a nationally acclaimed scholar practitioner and educator in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. Dr. Benitez is known for his down-to-earth, insightful commentary, and critical perspectives on social and cultural issues ranging from leadership and identity development, intersectionality, race and ethnicity, post-colonial thought, knowledge production, and critical pedagogy and practice in higher education. And we are thrilled to have him here with us today. Please welcome Dr. Michael Benitez.
Hello and good day to all. My name is Mike Benitez. I serve as the Vice President of MSU Denver. I also travel quite a bit around the United States, either speaking or consulting or doing workshops for different organizations. With that said, let me allow myself to introduce myself in my native tongue. Usa Weyu Watiao Didi, Mike Benitez, son of the land of Borinquen, born of Afro-Taino descent. I want to first, say thank you to Dr. Clay, to President Green, to all the faculty, the staff, the students, and all the community members tied to the fabric of Governor State University. Thank you so very much for the invitation to come and share space with you all. I am humbled by the invitation, always honored, particularly to speak in celebration of Dr. King, and always humbled as well. So I want to begin by acknowledging the land on which I stand here before you and that I occupy at this moment. I stand here in the territories of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho nations. It is not only important that we acknowledge, but it's also important that we start to truly cultivate relationships and mend historical harms that continue to plague today's moral obligations to one another, culturally speaking, and to be able to truly cultivate relationships with Indigenous and First Nation communities across the United States, beyond the acknowledgement to act and demonstrate action on our behalf. Dr. King, he would have been in his early 90s had white supremacy not taken him from our humanity on that April of 1968. He was a true leader and a follower of the people, responding to his moral compass and leaning into the voices of the people with absolute full conviction. It has been almost 60 years now since Dr. King delivered his powerful "I Have a Dream" speech that so often people refer to, that he did in Washington, D.C. in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And during that speech, he called for a unity of all people and truly beginning to unite Black and white voices at that time. However, I want to be clear that his vision wasn't just to, provide equal rights or about equal rights and protections for African Americans and Blacks oppressed and marginalized under law and society, but it was truly a cause about everyone's liberty, everyone's freedom, the hope that everyone can truly begin to work together and come together to fight against or push back against more grandiose, interlocking and systemic injustices. It was truly a multifaceted movement, one where poor working whites and Blacks and many from different backgrounds were moved to speak against racism and classism and militarism. And I outlined those three in particular because so much of his work triangulated that particular connection and those three systemic challenges during that time. And today, I really want to build on Dr. King's legacy and expand on that very vivid dream of a unified America and a unified democracy. Today, I really want to speak to the evolution of dreams. Dreams that are grounded in building legacies of justice for a 21st century America. Dreams that are intersectional. Dreams that are contemporary. Dreams that embrace the real tensions of humanity. Dreams that shatter the myriad of injustices still present in the residue of yesterday's doings. Dreams that acknowledge that the work that still needs to be done to fulfill a dream deferred is out there. You see, while we often speak to the Dr. King of unity, so rarely do we speak to and honor the Dr. King of conviction and accountability. We're so very quick to focus on this Dr. King that wanted to bring everyone together, but rarely are we attentive to a Dr. King that truly required of a nation to act on what they claimed to be their moral compass, their call to action around equality at the time and around what will be more of a equity today. If Dr. King has taught us one particular major lesson, he truly exemplified for us that our lives must be lived with intentionality and without regret. That words are powerful and they carry immense meaning, and that we can use those words at minimum, to speak up in the face of injustice. And I speak to you today in the spirit of one of my favorite quotes by Dr. King, and quote from his March of 1956 speech, when peace becomes obnoxious, during a gathering at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And this is what Dr. King said, in quote, "If peace means accepting second-class citizenship, I don't want it. If peace means keeping my mouth shut in the midst of injustice and evil, I don't want it. If peace means being complacently adjusted to a deadening status quo, I don't want peace. If peace means a willingness to be exploited economically, dominated politically, humiliated and segregated, I don't want peace." Right? This quote for me embodies the spirit of how America's formal and informal citizenry should move through the good struggles of our critical work for the time, to reimagine and evolve a dream for a 21st century multicultural America, right? And when I say multicultural, let me be clear that I define, culture and multiculturalism as one of truly shared cultures where we have not only race and ethnicity, but we're attentive to gender construction, where we're attentive to class and religion, and we're attentive to ability, and we're attentive to the variety of backgrounds that people bring to the table and coexist and share in intercultural ways. Now, this requires us to, number one, be able to look at differences between equality, equity, the reality and realization of full liberation for those oppressed and marginalized. And when you think equality, think about everyone getting the same thing. At the same time, though, you wouldn't give everyone the same size pair of shoes, right? If someone is a size 7, then they are more likely to go and purchase a size 7. If someone is a size 10, they'll go get a size 10. Not everyone gets a size 10. It's just not going to work. So today we're now grappling with this thing called equity, right? This idea that we meet people where they're at, or this idea that certain people, depending on their positionality, depending on their conditions, what they're wrestling and struggling with, what they need by way of support so that they can be successful, don't all need the same thing in the same way. And so how do we respond collectively yet individually to those needs to truly be equitable? And then there's the reality, right? So often we talk about where we're at and what the data shows and the research and the literature around discrimination and unfairness and bias. And what we don't see is the reality of the lives of many people who we can't quite understand until we are truly wearing their shoes, until we are walking their life. And then what does it mean on the flip side to come to a complete realization for the full liberation of those in the margins and those ostracized or who don't have the same opportunities, or even when they do get the opportunities, they have to figure out how to navigate and negotiate spaces in ways that may not necessarily align with who they are and their true authenticity. Right? And Dr. King, he wore authenticity really, really well. He never strayed aside from his mission, his vision, how he wished to serve the people's call, the people's messaging, and what they would tell him was important to address. It was truly a systemic and strategic effort based on the spirit of solidarity. As Dr. King expressed, In the end, we're going to remember, or we will remember, not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And I'm reminded about the letter from Birmingham jail that he wrote. I'm reminded about what he had to speak on and expose around liberalism and the nature of liberalism, and to what extent people were truly willing to stand in their conviction, even as he understood the risks involved, and question whether or not others were willing to take those same risks. So even within our own circles of advocacy, of internalized isms, and the internalized neocolonial dynamics that many times dictate how we choose to be there for each other or not, he still kept the course of conviction and leaning into the movement of justice and assuring that, or doing his best to assure that for everyone. And so number two then becomes, for today's legacy, a need to truly be attention to and address the intersections of injustice that we once ran from a result of how interlocking systems conversed with each other, right? Thinking about the way that law interacts with education, that then interacts with governance, right? These are the systems that are constantly in conversation with each other that dictate and inform what's right or not, or how we're all going to be impacted differently depending on how those interlocking systems choose to create policies that privilege some over others, or some people's way of being over other people's way of being and showing up. We have seen over the last several years the ways in which the systems are connected to each other, exposing the layers of disparate impact that many have known to be present for such a long time. But something like the pandemic made clear and truly exposed the ways in which something like public health interlocks with race, for example. Let's look at COVID. Right? Let's look at COVID, whereby we see who is more likely to be affected. BIPOC or people of color at the front lines are more likely to be the essential workers. People of color continue to work through the crisis just to survive. They're more likely to put themselves at risk just to keep their jobs. They can't chill at home for 6 months and say, I'm going to wait for this to pass. They're more likely to rely on food banks to feed their families, more likely to take care of their family and loved ones, more likely to live in larger households. They have poor access to healthcare, more likely to have underlying health conditions that make them at large at-risk communities. But one piece that is in particular, and it's a huge challenge, and we see this, unfolding, or we've seen it unfold over the last couple of years now, in very specific ways, and that is, people of color are less likely to seek out medical assistance, and only as a last resort. And I'm always gonna, for me personally, be able to combine knowledge and science with my own values. But there's also a history we haven't truly mended, whether it's the Tuskegee experiments, whether it is the life of Henrietta Lacks, whether it is the sterilization of women of color without consent throughout the US, historically speaking, or even going back to moments of enslavement, right? These are all tied to the medical field in some way today that still to this day carry a sentiment of distrust that we feel in communities of color. So I don't want to be dismissive of that. It's simply to say that contextually, this is such a complex and nuanced issue around the way that we understand justices and injustices. When we think about much of the killings of people of color, that has also exposed the ways in which many officers, for example, are not held to the same standards as their fellow citizens. And we've seen plenty of examples. Now, I'm not saying that I'm anti-cop. Let me be incredibly clear. I actually support police officers. I think that they are necessary. I think they're needed for the public safety of our citizenry. But I also believe that they should be held accountable when they act up or show up in ways that lead to, in particular, the fatalities of people of color or in the United States. that it took technology to, for example, amplify the killing of George Floyd at the hands of Officer Derek Chauvin to incite further curiosity about what is wrong with our system is a problem within itself when we think back about the videos that we saw on Rodney King. And I want to bring up a case, one in Florida, a bit over a decade ago now, whereby two young adults, one by the name of Chase Leglitner, who was a white 19-year-old man who robbed three men in a 2008 drug deal. And then there was another young man by the name of Lamar Lloyd, a 21-year-old African-American man who stuck up a Pizza Hut and a gas station in 2009. Now, both men pleaded no contest to two counts of armed robbery. We started to see that there were different outcomes with respect to this two young men. Then we started to see, right, the realities of how we are treated differently, in this case, on race. Now, it's not that we started to see, but if both pleaded no contest to two counts of armed robbery in Bauer's courtroom, and then Leglitner spent less than 2 years at the Martin County Jail, and Lloyd got 26 years in prison, then what are we saying about who we privilege? What are we saying about who we think has a chance to somehow get better or reform themselves or get their life straight, and who doesn't? Who gets tagged with the stigma of once a criminal, always a criminal? And then we have something else like the ongoing gentrification that makes clear who can afford to stay in their communities and who cannot. Even when we think back to the 1960s, we know that 40% of Black or African Americans had their own businesses and that 87% of Black families had two parents. Now, today, less than 7% of Blacks own their own businesses and 25% of Black families have two parents. And I bring this up to make clear that even after segregation was legally eradicated from systemic law, why is it that we found ourselves, Black communities, moving to white communities? We weren't seeing white communities flocking to Black communities in the same way. And what was that about? Now, we could come out with a different array of analysis, but there's something powerful about the way in which we've learned to adopt a norm of wanting to be part of the system, a system that for a very long time wasn't exactly embracing or accepting of anything other or outside than whiteness. Now, to lead into a critical and intentional civility that aims to assure we're able to bring our differences to the table with compassion, with radical love, with empathy, and with a genuine desire for all to be empowered, uplifted, and treated fairly, is another element of how we redefine or evolve a dream for a 21st century democracy in America, and what a legacy means for what and who we are today. Now, let me give you an example. If we get hurt and we get a cut and we go to the hospital, the doctor generally is going to look at the cut and they're going to, treat that cut. And we got to treat trauma, right? And we understand there's a lot of research that demonstrates the way in which trauma shows up in people of color communities or just marginalized communities beyond race and ethnicity overall. The trauma in women, the trauma in trans communities, the trauma in communities of poverty. But we rarely talk about that trauma in dominant ways. We rarely talk about that trauma in ways in which white people carry a trauma of not knowing, of ignorance, of now being hurt today or not knowing how to respond when they see injustices unfold in front of them. The same thing with males, the same thing with cisgender people. And I share that to say that we must attend to the wound, especially in education, right? This field where we can show up and be vulnerable, or we should be vulnerable and we should show up humbly. The intention be to continue to learn and grow so that we can eventually contribute, our best humanity to a humane democracy. That we can do that in just ways. So we must not show up to push people away who don't get it. We must show up to embrace, to some degree, the ignorance and attend to it no different than trauma or a wound. But we still need to be able to address the lingering systemic isms that continue to impact marginalized communities. Number 4, we really must begin to embrace new ways of thinking, and that account not only for the ways in which we want to be treated, but as the Platinum Rule says, treat others the way they want to be treated. For such a long time, we've operated under this assumption that if I like to be treated a certain way, that another human being, another person, is going to want to be treated in that same way as well. But that's not the case, right? The reality is that I maybe want to be treated or approached in a certain way, but other people may want to be approached and treated in the way that they prefer, not in the way that I see as the norm, simply because that's how I like to be treated. Again, we must shift and recenter how we think epistemologically around what and who serves as the center of what we aspire to do, who defines democracy and under what auspices. Number 5, we must be able to take responsibility and be accountable to each other and acknowledge the undeniable injustices and validate each other's experiences, sustain our courage so that we may keep alive our own opportunities for learning and growth. We must affirm and respect each other's humanities and integrate into our hearts and spirits a humility, right, that paves the way for solidarity at worst and unity at best. A big part of why prior movements were successful is not because everyone agreed on everything, it's because everyone understood what they were aiming to collectively achieve as a common vision, as a common goal. It doesn't mean they did everything the same, that they thought the same. And today we can see that more clearly because we also see that even within these different movements, that there's plenty of disagreement, there's plenty of back and forth, there's plenty of people who want to do it in different ways, but they eventually know how to cultivate and have learned to cultivate a solidarity that allows people to at least move forward collectively, assuring and knowing that if we take care of and think about those at the bottom, then everyone else who comes after is going to be okay, or that when we do something within the spirit of benefiting those who are the most vulnerable, it benefits all. Number 6, today we're at a moment where building legacies to address injustice requires us to lean on a mutual endeavoring, right? An endeavor that makes it possible for us to see who remains at the bottom and what are the underlying systems that cultivate and nurture division, right? An authentic leader should not be searching necessarily for existing consensus, for an agreement or people who already agree. When you think about authentic, justice-driven leadership, you're talking about a leadership that is looking to mold and shape the possibilities for consensus. It's easy to get a group of people or different communities who agree together, but it is incredibly challenging and requires some real strategy and intentionality with respect to what it means to build consensus, an agreement, a shared goal, or a common vision. You know, in his book from 2014, Ed Landurek, who's a professor emeritus out of St. Olaf, he wrote a book. It's called Civil Disagreement, Personal Integrity in a Pluralistic Society. And he goes on to provide this definition, or at least speak to civility in a way that I've learned to embrace over the years, especially in my role with DEI in higher education. And he goes on to say, and quote, civility is treating others with appropriate courtesy and respect. Much of what civility involves is context relative, and often it is relative mainly to what is needed for a shared task or a mutual endeavor. Then the question of what civility requires in a given context or association is related to the question of what we are trying to accomplish together. Notice that the context may well include people who are strangers and even past opponents. So we cannot rely on affection friendship, or familiarity to set boundaries. Civility is something we intentionally bring to the situation, not necessarily something that flows from natural feelings. Notice also that civility involves patience and restraints. It has much to do with what we will not do to each other as what we will do for each other. So in this quote, he's very particular that we need to show up with a good faith effort. We need to show up thinking the best of each other. We need to show up with these two words that I really, really feel are so important as part of creating, cultivating, and establishing sustainable movements for a 21st century effort to address injustices. He used patience and restraint. So that we need to be attentive to the speed race, but we also need to be attentive to the marathon. Now, that leads me to number 7. And it's tied to that marathon that I'm referring to, right? We must be familiar now more than ever with who bears the brunt of injustice. What does it mean when one respectfully and nicely expresses support for the demise of others? Whether that be women of color, trans communities, immigrant communities. And I say this from a place of being in a position and doing this work for so long that I've seen the ways in which when we have these conversations, it is very easy for someone, even respectfully and with the utmost nice that someone can show up, to tell somebody, if you were gone tomorrow, I will be okay. So at what moment do we step back and say, hey, I don't know if you're someone who I want to be hanging around, or if I'm okay if I'm part of your circle, because when push comes to shove, you're not going to advocate for my existence. Right? And I'm talking about folks who maybe, for one example, disagree with something like immigration and are real quick to say deport them, place them in detention camps, knowing very well that their deportation on the other side might result in death. It may result in their demise. You know, I remember at my former institution when everything was happening around ICE showing up on college campuses and trying to get information of undocumented citizens. And I say that undocumented citizens no different in the way I use informal and formal citizenry, because for me, undocumented citizens are very much a part of the American fabric and contribute immensely to not only the American fabric, society, and culture, but especially to the economic engine of what keeps us going. And one of the things that I made very clear, and it was risky, but it speaks to that conviction, is look, if ICE comes to this campus, they're taking me with the students, or they're going to have to drag me out of the way before they even get to the students. And that's what I'm referring to when I speak about the conviction in which Dr. King acted. And the conviction in which we understand this power dynamics, we understand it's risky, we understand that we could get fired, we understand that it's going to interrupt our livelihoods. But what does stepping into that work mean, knowing the consequences that come with this work? When we start to address the intersectionality of oppressed identities, then what we do is we assure that all identities are both provided the space to lead and voice their experiences, so that the likes of Bayard Rustin, Barbara Jordan, Ernestine Eckstein, Daisy Bates, Fannie Lou Hamer, Audre Lorde, Alvin Bailey, Ella Baker, and James Baldwin, among many, many others, are not relegated to the shadows of civil rights issues. And I love that we're seeing that today when you think about the Black Lives Matters and other movements that are intersectional. When you think about who's doing this work out today, they're very clear that we must be attentive to the array of identities and array of positionalities that we hold within our bodies, our souls, our spirits, how we show up. We can't continue to relegate the least desirable or what we think is going to be detrimental to a movement because we see a vision that doesn't account for the most vulnerable. We must operate on hope, and we must operate on a way that repositions us and ourselves at the center epistemically and make clear that whiteness, maleness, cisgenderness do not sit at the center of knowledge production and action, right? Evolving the dream requires us all to suspend our disbelief towards experiences of difference so that we may acknowledge the pain, that we may acknowledge the hurt that has been passed down through generations in order to arrive at some mending and healing, some reckoning that permits us to broaden what society has been taught to perceive as the norm, or as the late James Baldwin said. And James is, really just one of my favorite authors, if not my favorite author, so ahead of his time, but also, again, through his writings, he exposed so much that wasn't yet acceptable in the front lines, right? And he goes on, he quotes, "You have to decide who you are and force the world to deal with you, not with its idea of you," end quote. So we can navigate and negotiate systems of dominance today, right? But I hope that we're still doing it with authenticity, because if the norm in society doesn't see the authenticity that we bring to the table, then it will continue to assume that part of this change that needs to happen to address injustices means those marginalized, those who are not the norm, having to acculturate or assimilate to get through a system not made for them. And I think about the quote by Audre Lorde, or something to the extent of, where she speaks to not using the slave master's tools to dismantle the slave master house. But I offer also a critical conversation with that, because, Audre Lorde, another one of my favorite authors, I like to think, what if? In what if ways? Because I like to think in possibilities. Possibilities is where the hope lies that allows us to be okay with not knowing everything that's in front of us or what the outcomes are going to be that we're aiming for. And that is, what if the slave master's tools never belonged to the slave master in the first place? How about if those tools were colonized from our ancestors? Then it's no wonder when marginalized communities enter systems and spaces of dominance, we learn to use those very same tools as good, if not better, than the slave master himself. And so we then show up, not necessarily to try to belong. We know we already belong. We show up to reclaim. We show up to be very particular and to be very intentional and very clear about our belongingness, not seeking to belong, but establishing how we already belong. And so as I bring this to a conclusion, as we think about what building legacies for a 21st century, justice impetus looks like, I like to quote Bell Hooks, who says, "Sometimes people try to destroy you precisely because they recognize the power. They recognize your power, not because they don't see it, but because they see it and they don't want it to exist." And that makes me think about this thing called access. And even as we've gone through this process, the civil rights movement of desegregation and integration and opening up schools and housing and spaces to everyone, and not only relegated for people from white backgrounds, for example, I'm also thinking about the amount of years, 300 plus years, that it took generationally to cultivate that thinking that we're working today to demystify, that we're working today to uproot, to dismantle and uproot. I'm thinking about the ways in which a people have for so long thought this is the way it is and should be and how it always has been, and constructions of superiority and inferiority, that when folks who are not like them or who they have over generations learned that are less like them, all of a sudden not only show up to the same spaces with the same ability to succeed in the same ways, but in many cases even surpass them. and how much that sits with them or interrupts and ruptures their normativity around who's at the top and who's at the bottom, or who should be at the top, and create the policies and rules that dictate society and the way we act and behave and show up versus the latter, or versus not. And I think about what does it mean today within the context of this pandemic to do something like acknowledging the impact and have conversations around impact and truly understand who bears the brunt of injustice. I'm thinking about a particular case, back in the early 2000s, where a young man by the name of Ahmed Muhammad, 14 years old, was arrested for building a clock made out of wood. Meanwhile, another young man, a white male, Muhammad was Muslim, Taylor Wilson was white, was recognized and even offered encouragement and support by Homeland Security for building a nuclear fusion reactor. And I want to put those next to each other. A nuclear fusion reactor, a wooden clock. The kid with the wooden clock was suspended. There was this whole media ordeal. It made the national news. There was some uprise. But Tyler, who built a nuclear fusion reactor, and so when we think about this evolution, we must be attentive to the ways in which othering, or who's being oppressed, or who's being targeted shifts and evolves according with the national landscape as well as the international landscape. Nobody was thinking about Islamophobia, prior to 9/11. After 9/11, everybody started thinking about Islamophobia because anyone who looked like, perceivably, right? Because that's a big part of the issue is we look at people, make assumptions about who they are many a times, started to target Muslim communities. So what does it mean then? Right? What does it mean to be attentive to those shifts, to be attending to the ways in which injustice evolves and targets groups of people based on what's going on nationally and internationally, right? We walk through spaces differently. The idea of being treated fairly is so far-fetched for many who experience injustices growing up. But for many others who haven't experienced identity-based struggles, they react in flabbergasted ways. They react in ways where they don't get it or they're surprised. Meanwhile, you're sitting there to yourself and saying, my first experience with exclusion was when I was 4 or 5 years old. Some people can truly recollect going that far back, because that's how powerful those experiences are and how well they permeate and sit with who you are as a person and how you elect eventually to live your life. Either you ignore it and just go through it and say, I'm not going to let anything impact me, even as it's eating away slowly at your mental health or soul. Or on the other hand, you're going to address it and face it and do what you need to be able to face it the best way that you can. And there's no wrong way of doing it. In the context of higher education, when I think about student leadership, for example, and the ways we honor legacies, that means that we think about how people contribute in their own ways. Some students like to be in the front lines. Some like to be the presidents. Others like to be the organizers behind the scene, not necessarily be in the front lines. Other people use film and documentaries to expose injustices. Other people write books or poetry to expose injustices and bring attention to injustices. Other people who maybe are in industry eventually do well for themselves and tackle these issues through those systemic processes and spaces, doing things like creating scholarship funds or, creating foundations so that opportunities can be made available materialistically for people who don't have access to have the same opportunities as someone else. And so I end with one more quote that is so important from Dr. King, because it really highlights the way in which we need to think and shift, especially within the context of Black Lives Matters, right? And the moment that they started to reignite this movement, and hundreds of thousands of people showing up across the United States, and in some cases even millions, to protest or to speak up against injustices. I'm thinking about what do we define and understand as just or unjust. And so Dr. King, has this quote: one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. And what he's saying there, right, is that there is this thing called just and there is this thing called unjust. And we've seen it throughout humanity. It was at one point legal to be inhumane. It was legal to enslave. It was legal to kill. It was legal to treat differently. The onus was put on the people to not cross that line. Otherwise, they got what they had coming. They had what they got what they deserved. So I leave you with one saying that I always use when I'm speaking out there or when I'm in these difficult conversations, and that is, what happens when honest meets nice? Can nice be as welcoming to honest? Or what happens when arrogance doesn't speak humility? Does the onus fall on humility to embrace arrogance? And at what point does arrogance, particularly among marginalized communities, is a misinterpretation of authenticity, assertiveness, and I'm here. I'm here to make a present. I'm here because I'm tired of erasure. So for all, I ask of you to lean on the courage, to lean on the hope, to lean on even the little bit of progress that we've been able to make as that hope, but that we also take care of ourselves and our mental health and our well-being so that we could show up our best selves to a movement to address and take on injustices that will eventually transform into a better future, not only for us as we age or as we go through life, but in particular for the future generations who are going to take on this world that we leave to them as we go on and eventually join our ancestors. With that said, much peace, much love, and have a wonderful and productive Dr. King Day. Thank you all. Gratitude and appreciation.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Benitez, for the powerful and insightful words you shared with us today. It is our hope that everything you've heard today will challenge you to take action in the pursuit of equality and justice for all. We would like to thank the following individuals and departments for their contributions and support of today's program: Dr. Michael Benitez, Mr. Todd Rasean Buckley, Mr. Carl Hampton, the Digital Learning Media Design Team, Dr. Robert Clay, Dean Corey Williams, the Center for Student Engagement and Intercultural Programs team, the Marketing Department, and especially you. We look forward to seeing you all next year. Thank you for keeping the dream alive.